Sarah Martinez stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, her frame appearing almost fragile against the imposing backdrop of Camp Pendleton's training grounds. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete parade deck where dozens of Marine recruits lined up for their first day of combat training. At 22, Sarah had always been the smallest person in any room, but she had never let her size define her capabilities. Today, however, surrounded by towering figures who looked like they could bench press small cars, she felt the familiar sting of doubt creeping into her mind. The drill instructors prowled the formation like predators sizing up their prey. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a barrel-chested man with arms like tree trunks, stopped directly in front of Sarah. His eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, seemed to bore right through her. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he studied her from head to toe, taking in her slight build and delicate features that seemed more suited for a college campus than a military base. "What's your name, recruit?" Rodriguez barked, his voice carrying across the entire formation. "Sarah Martinez, Staff Sergeant," she replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies doing aerial maneuvers in her stomach. Rodriguez circled her slowly, like a shark sensing blood in the water. "Martinez, you look like a strong wind could blow you away. What makes you think you belong here with these warriors?" His question wasn't meant to be encouraging. It was designed to break down her confidence before the real training even began. Sarah had heard variations of this question her entire life. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she had been the girl who was always picked last for sports teams, the one who couldn't reach the top shelf at the grocery store without asking for help, the one whose handshake was often dismissed with a condescending smile. But beneath her unassuming exterior burned a fire that had been kindled by years of being underestimated. "I belong here because I earned my place, Staff Sergeant," she answered, meeting his gaze through the reflective lenses of his sunglasses. A low murmur rippled through the formation. Some recruits snickered, others looked impressed by her boldness. Rodriguez's expression remained unreadable, but Sarah caught the slightest twitch at the corner of his mouth. Whether it was amusement or approval, she couldn't tell. The first week of training was a brutal introduction to military life. Sarah struggled with the physical demands that seemed effortless for her male counterparts. During the morning runs, she found herself falling behind the pack, her shorter legs working twice as hard to maintain pace. The obstacle courses were particularly challenging, with walls that seemed designed for people a foot taller than her. Every rope climb was a battle against gravity and her own limitations. But it wasn't just the physical challenges that tested her resolve. It was the constant commentary from her fellow recruits that cut deeper than any physical pain. Marcus Thompson, a former college football player from Alabama, seemed to take particular pleasure in pointing out her struggles. "Look at Martinez," he would say during chow time, loud enough for half the mess hall to hear. "She's breathing harder than my grandmother after climbing a flight of stairs." His comments always drew laughs from his circle of followers, mostly other large recruits who had sailed through the physical requirements without breaking a sweat. Jessica Chun, one of the few other female recruits in their platoon, tried to offer support. "Ignore them," she whispered during one particularly brutal day of combat training. "They're just insecure about their own abilities." But Sarah didn't need comfort. She needed results. Every night, after lights out, she lay in her bunk analyzing her performance, identifying weaknesses, and planning improvements. She had always been analytical by nature, approaching problems with the methodical precision that had earned her a degree in mechanical engineering before enlisting. If she couldn't overpower her opponents, she would have to outthink them. The turning point came during the third week when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez announced they would begin hand-to-hand combat training. The recruits were paired off for basic grappling exercises, and Sarah found herself matched against David Park, a quiet but powerfully built recruit from Oregon who had worked construction before joining the Marines. "This isn't going to be pretty," Marcus called out from the sidelines, earning another round of chuckles from his admirers. David looked apologetic as they faced off on the training mats. "I'll try to go easy," he said quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the mismatch. Sarah appreciated his kindness, but she didn't want his pity. "Just do your best," she replied. "I can handle myself." The instructor demonstrated the basic takedown they were supposed to practice, then set the pairs loose. David moved slowly, telegraphing his intentions clearly to give Sarah time to react. But even with his restraint, his superior size and strength were immediately apparent. Within seconds, Sarah found herself pinned to the mat, David's weight making it impossible for her to move. "Good, Park," Rodriguez called out. Martinez, you need to use leverage, not muscle. Try again. They reset, and the result was the same. And again, and again. Each failure drew more smirks and whispered comments from the watching recruits. Sarah could feel her cheeks burning with embarrassment, but she refused to quit. There had to be a way to level the playing field. That evening, Sarah made her way to the base library, a small building that most recruits ignored in favor of the recreation center. She spent hours poring over books on martial arts, physics, and human anatomy. She studied leverage points, pressure points, and the biomechanics of human movement. If brute force wasn't going to work, she needed to find another way. The next morning brought more combat training, and once again Sarah found herself struggling against larger, stronger opponents. But this time, she was watching, learning, taking mental notes of how they moved, where they were strong, and, more importantly, where they were vulnerable. During a break in training, she approached Corporal Williams, one of the assistant instructors who had been observing the sessions. Williams was a compact, wiry man who moved with the fluid grace of an experienced fighter. Unlike some of the other instructors, he had been watching Sarah's struggles with professional interest rather than amusement. "Corporal Williams," Sarah said, approaching him respectfully. "I was wondering if you could give me some advice on the combat training." Williams studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Walk with me, Martinez." They moved away from the main group, stopping near a shaded area beside the training building. Williams leaned against the wall, his expression thoughtful. "You're trying to fight their fight," he said without preamble. "That's a losing strategy. You'll never outmuscle Thompson or Park or any of the big guys. But that doesn't mean you can't beat them." Sarah listened intently as Williams began to explain the finer points of combat that weren't covered in the basic training curriculum. He talked about timing, about using an opponent's strength and momentum against them, about the difference between fighting harder and fighting smarter. "The best fighters I've known weren't always the biggest or strongest," Williams continued. "They were the ones who could think 3 moves ahead, who could turn every disadvantage into an advantage. You've got the mind for it, Martinez. I can see it in how you watch the other recruits, how you analyze every movement. You just need to trust yourself." That conversation planted a seed that would grow into something much larger. Sarah began to see her size not as a limitation, but as a different kind of asset. She was faster than the big guys, more agile, harder to grab and hold. She just needed to learn how to use those advantages effectively. The opportunity to put her new understanding to the test came sooner than expected. During the 4th week of training, Rodriguez announced a special exercise. Instead of the usual paired combat drills, they would be doing group scenarios designed to simulate real combat situations. "This isn't a game," Rodriguez warned the assembled recruits. "You'll be working in teams, and every team member needs to pull their weight. If you can't handle yourself in a fight, you're a liability to your unit." The exercise was structured as a series of challenges that required both individual combat skills and team coordination. Sarah found herself assigned to a team with 4 other recruits, including Marcus Thompson. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was grouped with one of her loudest critics. Their first challenge was a scenario where they had to secure a building occupied by opposing forces, played by instructors and senior recruits. The team had to work together to overcome the defenders and complete their objective. It sounded simple in theory, but Sarah knew it would be anything but easy in practice. Marcus immediately assumed leadership of the group, his commanding presence and size making him a natural focal point. "All right, here's the plan," he announced, gathering the team around him. "We go in hard and fast. I'll take point. Johnson and Rodriguez will flank left. Patterson takes the right side. Martinez." He paused, looking at Sarah with obvious uncertainty. "You stay back and provide support." Sarah bit back her first response. She had ideas about how they should approach the building, tactical insights that came from her engineering background, and her growing understanding of combat dynamics. But she also knew that challenging Marcus's leadership before they had even begun would only create division within the team. "What kind of support?" she asked instead, keeping her tone neutral. Marcus shrugged. "I don't know, just stay out of the way and help if someone gets in trouble." It was a polite way of benching her, but Sarah accepted it for now. She would prove her worth through actions, not arguments. The exercise began with a whistle blast that echoed across the training area. Marcus led the charge toward the building, his team following in the formation he had outlined. The defending force was ready for them, of course. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and 2 other instructors had positioned themselves strategically throughout the building, turning what should have been a straightforward assault into a complex puzzle. Marcus's direct approach ran into immediate resistance. As soon as he tried to breach the front entrance, he found himself engaged in hand-to-hand combat with Rodriguez. The staff sergeant was giving no quarter, treating the exercise with the same intensity he would bring to a real fight. Within moments, Marcus was on the ground, officially eliminated from the exercise. The rest of the team scrambled to adapt, but, without their self-appointed leader, they quickly fell into disarray. Johnson and Rodriguez tried to execute the flanking maneuver, but they were picked off one by the defending instructors. Patterson lasted slightly longer, but eventually found himself overpowered and eliminated as well. That left Sarah alone, facing 3 experienced instructors in a building she hadn't even entered yet. The logical response would have been to surrender and accept defeat. After all, if 4 larger, stronger recruits couldn't handle the situation, what chance did she have? But Sarah had been watching the entire scenario unfold, and she had seen something her teammates had missed. The instructors were defending the building exactly as she would have expected them to, by controlling the obvious entry points and using their superior positioning to their advantage. But buildings had more than just front doors and ground floor windows. While her teammates had been focused on the direct approach, Sarah had been studying the building's architecture. She had noticed the external fire escape, the roof access, the basement windows that were slightly ajar. More importantly, she had been timing the instructors' movements, noting their patrol patterns, and identifying the gaps in their coverage. Instead of following her teammates into the front of the building, Sarah circled around to the rear. She found what she was looking for, a maintenance entrance that was being ignored by the defenders who were focused on the main approaches. The door was locked, but Sarah's engineering background included some practical skills that weren't part of the standard Marine training curriculum. Getting inside was only the first step. Now she had to navigate a building full of instructors who were specifically looking for her, and she had to do it without being detected. Sarah moved through the corridors with careful precision, using every piece of cover available and timing her movements to avoid the defenders' patrol routes. She found her first opportunity on the second floor. Corporal Williams was positioned at a window overlooking the main approach, his attention focused on the area where Sarah's teammates had made their failed assault. He was alone, confident that the remaining threat would come from the obvious direction. Sarah had spent weeks learning from Williams, studying his techniques and his fighting style. She knew his strengths, but, more importantly, she had identified his patterns. Williams was a methodical fighter who relied on technique and experience, but he also had a tendency to focus intently on whatever was in front of him. Moving with the silent precision she had been practicing, Sarah approached from Williams's blind spot. She had learned that the key to defeating a larger opponent wasn't to match their strength, but to neutralize it before they could bring it to bear. In this case, that meant striking before Williams even knew she was there. The takedown was textbook perfect, using Williams's own balance against him and applying pressure to points that would incapacitate without causing injury. Williams found himself on the ground, officially eliminated, before he had fully processed what had happened. "Outstanding, Martinez," he whispered as he played dead for the remainder of the exercise. "That was exactly what I was talking about. 1 down, 2 to go." But now the real challenge began, because the remaining instructors would be alert to her presence and actively hunting for her. Sarah had lost the element of surprise, and she was still outnumbered 2-1 in an environment where her opponents had every advantage. The building had become a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Sarah as the mouse trying to outmaneuver 2 very experienced cats. She could hear them communicating, coordinating their search, closing off escape routes. They were treating her as a serious threat now, not the afterthought she had been at the beginning of the exercise. Sarah found her second opportunity in an unexpected place, the building's main hallway, where Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was moving methodically from room to room. He was being careful, checking corners, and maintaining awareness of his surroundings, but he was also operating under the assumption that Sarah would try to avoid direct confrontation. Instead, Sarah did exactly what Rodriguez wouldn't expect. She engaged him head-on, but not in the way he was prepared for. Using her smaller size and greater agility, she turned the hallway into an obstacle course, using the walls, door frames, and even the ceiling fixtures to her advantage. The fight was brief, but intense. Rodriguez was stronger and more experienced, but Sarah was fighting on her terms now, using every inch of space to her advantage and never letting him establish the kind of stable grappling position that would allow him to use his superior strength. When Rodriguez hit the ground, officially eliminated, there was genuine surprise in his eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Maybe you do belong here after all, Martinez." The final instructor proved to be the most challenging. Sergeant First Class Murphy was the senior combat instructor, a man whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his reputation for being absolutely unbeatable in hand-to-hand combat. He had been watching Sarah's progress through the building, and by the time she found him, he was ready. But Sarah had learned something important during her time at Camp Pendleton. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to choose not to fight at all. Instead of engaging Murphy directly, she used the building's architecture and her growing understanding of combat psychology to create a scenario where Murphy's strengths became irrelevant. The exercise ended with Sarah completing the objective while Murphy was still searching for her in the wrong part of the building. It wasn't a traditional victory in the sense of physical combat, but it was a complete tactical success that demonstrated everything the Marine Corps valued: adaptability, intelligence, and the ability to complete the mission regardless of the obstacles. As the whistle blew to signal the end of the exercise, Sarah emerged from her concealment to find her entire team and all the instructors staring at her in amazement. Marcus Thompson, still nursing his bruised ego from his early elimination, looked like he couldn't decide whether to be impressed or annoyed. "Martinez," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez called out as the group reassembled for debriefing. "Front and center." Sarah approached, unsure whether she was about to be praised or disciplined. Rodriguez's expression was unreadable as he looked her up and down, just as he had on that first day when he had questioned whether she belonged at Camp Pendleton. "That," he said finally, "was the most impressive display of tactical thinking I've seen from a recruit in 15 years of instruction. You didn't just complete the mission, Martinez. You redefined what the mission could be." The debriefing that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her time in training. Instead of the usual criticism and correction, the instructors were genuinely interested in her tactical approach, asking detailed questions about her decision-making process and her analysis of the scenario. But, perhaps more importantly, she noticed a change in how her fellow recruits looked at her. The smirks and dismissive comments had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like respect. Marcus Thompson, in particular, seemed to be seeing her for the first time as something other than a liability. "I have to admit," Marcus said quietly as they walked back to the barracks after the exercise, "I was wrong about you, Martinez. That was really something." Sarah nodded, accepting his acknowledgement without gloating. She had proven her point, but she also knew that this was just the beginning. The real test would be whether she could maintain this level of performance consistently, and whether her fellow Marines would continue to see her as an asset rather than a burden. That night, as she lay in her bunk reviewing the day's events, Sarah reflected on how far she had come since that first day when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had questioned her place at Camp Pendleton. She had started as the recruit everyone expected to wash out, the small girl who looked like she belonged in a library rather than a battlefield. But she had discovered something important about herself during those weeks of training. Her size wasn't a weakness to be overcome, it was a different kind of strength to be leveraged. She would never be the biggest or strongest Marine, but she was learning to be something potentially more valuable, the smartest, most adaptable, and most tactically creative. The road ahead was still long and challenging. She had weeks more of training before graduation, and then the real test of active duty service. But for the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, Sarah felt like she truly belonged. She had earned her place not by conforming to what others expected a Marine to be, but by redefining what a Marine could be. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah smiled to herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, and new chances to show everyone, including herself, just how much strength could come in a small package. The girl they had called weak during training was just getting started. The morning after Sarah's tactical triumph brought no rest or celebration. Instead, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had arranged what he called advanced combat scenarios, a polite way of saying that Sarah's success had painted a target on her back. Word of the small recruit who had outmaneuvered 3 experienced instructors had spread throughout Camp Pendleton like wildfire, and now everyone wanted to see if her performance had been a fluke or the real deal. Sarah arrived at the training ground to find a crowd of instructors and senior recruits gathered around the combat area. Among them was Master Sergeant Patricia Hayes, a legendary figure whose reputation for producing elite Marines was matched only by her reputation for breaking recruits who couldn't meet her impossibly high standards. Hayes was a woman who had fought her way to the top of a male-dominated profession through sheer determination and tactical brilliance, and she didn't suffer weakness in any form. "Martinez," Hayes called out as Sarah approached. "I hear you think you're something special." Sarah had learned enough about military protocol to recognize a test when she heard one. "No, Master Sergeant. I just did my job." Hayes circled Sarah slowly, her piercing gray eyes taking in every detail. "Your job was to complete the mission. You did that. But your real job as a Marine is to be ready for anything, anytime, against any opponent." Yesterday was just the beginning. The crowd of observers had grown larger, and Sarah could feel their eyes on her like a physical weight. Some faces showed curiosity, others skepticism, and a few displayed the kind of anticipation that suggested they were hoping to see her fail spectacularly. Among the crowd, she spotted Marcus Thompson and several other recruits from her platoon, all watching with intense interest. "Today's exercise is simple," Hayes continued. "You'll face 5 opponents in succession. Each one represents a different type of combat challenge you might encounter in the field. Your job is to neutralize each opponent using whatever means necessary. No weapons, no backup, just you and your training." Sarah felt her stomach drop. 5 opponents in succession was beyond anything she had trained for. In a normal combat scenario, Marines fought as part of a unit, supporting each other and sharing the burden of engagement. This was something entirely different, a test designed to push her to her absolute limits, and likely beyond them. "Master Sergeant," Sarah said carefully, "is this a standard training exercise?" Hayes smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Nothing about your situation is standard, Martinez. You want to prove you belong here? Then prove it." The first opponent was introduced as Corporal James Mitchell, a recent graduate of Marine combat training who specialized in traditional wrestling and grappling. Mitchell was built like a tank, broad shoulders, thick neck, and arms that looked like they could bend steel bars. He approached the center of the training mat with confidence, clearly expecting this to be a quick and easy victory. "Nothing personal, Martinez," Mitchell said as they faced off. "But this is going to be over real quick." Sarah had spent the previous evening studying combat footage and analyzing different fighting styles. She had learned that wrestlers like Mitchell relied on specific techniques, taking opponents to the ground, using superior body weight to control position, and applying submission holds until their opponents had no choice but to surrender. The key to defeating a wrestler was to prevent them from implementing their game plan. The match began with Mitchell charging forward, attempting to grab Sarah around the waist and take her to the ground. It was exactly what Sarah had expected. Instead of trying to resist his charge directly, she used his momentum against him, stepping aside at the last moment and allowing his own force to carry him past her. Mitchell stumbled, but recovered quickly, turning to face her with newfound respect. "Okay, so you're not going to make this easy." "Good." What followed was a chess match played at combat speed. Mitchell would attempt to close distance and initiate grappling, while Sarah used footwork and positioning to stay out of his reach. She couldn't afford to let him get his hands on her. Once he did, his superior size and strength would end the fight quickly. But staying away wasn't enough. Sarah needed to find a way to go on the offensive without playing into Mitchell's strengths. She found her opportunity when Mitchell overcommit to a takedown attempt, leaving himself momentarily off balance. Sarah struck with surgical precision, targeting pressure points that would temporarily disrupt his nervous system without causing permanent damage. Mitchell went down hard, his body momentarily unable to respond to his brain's commands. By the time he recovered, the match was over, and Sarah was standing over him with a look of quiet satisfaction. "Outstanding technique, Martinez," Hayes called out. But that was just the warm-up. Opponent number 2. The second challenger was Staff Sergeant David Park, no relation to the David Park from Sarah's platoon, who specialized in boxing and striking. Where Mitchell had been a grappler who wanted to take the fight to the ground, Park was a stand-up fighter who preferred to keep the action vertical and rely on superior hand speed and power. Park was lean and wiry, with the kind of build that suggested explosive speed rather than raw strength. He moved around the mat with the fluid grace of an experienced boxer, his hands up in a classic fighting stance. "I've been watching your technique, Martinez," Park said as they circled each other. "You're good at using size and leverage against grapplers. Let's see how you handle someone who fights at range." Park's strategy became immediately apparent. He used his longer reach to keep Sarah at a distance where she couldn't effectively apply the close-quarters techniques that had worked against Mitchell. Every time Sarah tried to close the gap, Park would snap out a quick jab or cross that forced her to retreat. Sarah realized she was facing a completely different type of problem. Against Mitchell, she had been able to use his aggression and forward momentum against him. Park was more patient, more controlled, content to pick her apart from the outside rather than rushing in for a decisive engagement. The solution came from an unexpected source, her engineering background. Sarah began to think about the fight in terms of angles and timing, mathematical concepts that could be applied to physical movement. If Park was controlling the distance and timing of the engagement, she needed to create variables that he couldn't control. Sarah began using the boundaries of the training mat to her advantage, forcing Park to adjust his positioning and creating opportunities for her to change the angles of attack. When Park expected her to retreat from his strikes, she moved laterally instead. When he anticipated lateral movement, she changed levels entirely. The breakthrough came when Sarah managed to get inside Park's guard during one of his combinations. Once she was close enough that his longer reach became a disadvantage, she applied the same pressure point techniques that had worked against Mitchell. Park dropped to one knee, his arms temporarily unable to function properly, and Sarah had her second victory. 2 down, Hayes announced, but her expression showed no satisfaction. Let's see if you can maintain that level of performance under real pressure. The third opponent was unlike the first two in every possible way. Sergeant Maria Santos was a compact, powerful woman who had earned her reputation through years of combat experience in Afghanistan and Iraq. Santos wasn't just a trainer. She was a veteran who had fought in real battles against real enemies who were trying to kill her. "I've heard about you, Martinez," Santos said as they prepared to engage. "You beat a couple of guys who fight by the rules. But I don't fight by rules. I fight to win." Santos proved her point immediately. Instead of following the structured approach of the previous opponents, she came at Sarah with a combination of techniques that seemed to draw from every combat discipline simultaneously. She would throw a boxing combination, transition into a takedown attempt, and follow up with strikes that would have been illegal in any organized sport. For the first time since the exercise began, Sarah found herself on the defensive. Santos was unpredictable, aggressive, and completely willing to take risks that the previous opponents hadn't considered. More importantly, Santos was fighting with the kind of intensity that suggested she genuinely wanted to hurt her opponent. Sarah realized that her analytical approach, which had worked so well against opponents who followed predictable patterns, was less effective against someone who refused to be predictable. She needed to adapt her strategy on the fly, finding ways to deal with threats she hadn't anticipated. The turning point came when Sarah stopped trying to predict what Santos would do next and started focusing on what Santos wasn't doing. Despite her aggressive and seemingly chaotic approach, Santos was still operating within certain parameters. She was still avoiding techniques that would cause serious injury, still pulling her punches at the last moment, still fighting within the bounds of training exercise rather than actual combat. Sarah began to exploit those boundaries, using Santos's restraint against her. When Santos pulled a punch to avoid injuring her, Sarah was ready with a counterattack. When Santos hesitated to apply a submission hold too forcefully, Sarah escaped and reversed position. The fight ended with Santos on the ground, not from any single technique, but from accumulated pressure and tactical adjustments that had gradually shifted the momentum of the engagement. Santos looked up at Sarah with something that might have been respect. "Not bad, Martinez," Santos said as she got to her feet. "You might actually survive your first deployment." But Sarah's celebration was short-lived. Hayes immediately called for the fourth opponent, and Sarah felt her energy reserves beginning to flag. 3 consecutive fights, each requiring maximum effort and concentration, had taken their toll. Her breathing was heavy, her muscles were beginning to fatigue, and she could feel the accumulated stress of the day wearing on her mental focus. The fourth opponent was Gunnery Sergeant Robert Chun, a man whose reputation preceded him throughout Camp Pendleton. Chun was known for 2 things: his absolute mastery of multiple martial arts, and his complete inability to go easy on opponents regardless of their size, experience, or gender. If Hayes had wanted to test Sarah's limits, Chun was the perfect choice. "I've been watching your fights, Martinez," Chun said as he stepped onto the mat. "You're good. Better than good, actually. But I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've never lost a training fight to a recruit. I'm not planning to start today." Chun's approach was different from all the previous opponents. Where Mitchell had relied on wrestling, Park on boxing, and Santos on aggression, Chen seemed to have no specific style at all. Instead, he adapted his technique to counter whatever Sarah tried to do, switching fluidly between different martial arts disciplines as the situation demanded. When Sarah tried to use her speed advantage, Chen slowed the pace of the fight and forced her into extended grappling exchanges. When she attempted to create distance and use her tactical awareness, Chen closed the gap and forced close-quarters combat. Every strength Sarah had displayed in previous fights, Chen had an answer for. For the first time since the exercise began, Sarah found herself in serious trouble. Chen's experience and versatility were overwhelming her ability to adapt, and her fatigue was making it harder to think clearly and respond quickly. She was being systematically outfought by someone who had seen every technique she could attempt and had developed counters for all of them. The fight seemed to be heading toward an inevitable conclusion when Sarah had a moment of clarity. She realized that she had been trying to beat Chen using techniques and strategies that he had seen before. But Chen hadn't seen her real advantage, her ability to think outside the conventional frameworks of combat training. Instead of trying to defeat Chen through superior technique, Sarah began to treat the fight like an engineering problem. She started creating systematic pressure on specific points of his defense, not looking for immediate results, but building toward a cumulative effect that would create an opening she could exploit. Chen recognized what she was doing almost immediately. "Clever girl," he murmured as he adjusted his own strategy to counter her approach. "But I've seen that trick before too." What followed was a battle of intellects played out through physical combat. Chen and Sarah each tried to outthink the other, developing and abandoning strategies in real time as their opponent adapted. The physical techniques became secondary to the mental chess match that was unfolding between them. The end came suddenly and unexpectedly. Sarah had been systematically testing Chen's responses to different types of pressure, and she finally found the combination that created the opening she needed. It wasn't a dramatic finish, just a moment when Chen's defenses aligned in exactly the wrong way, giving Sarah the split second she needed to apply a submission hold that Chen couldn't escape from. Chen tapped out with obvious reluctance, his expression mixing frustration with grudging admiration. 20 years, he said as he got to his feet. 20 years, and a recruit just schooled me. I don't know whether to be impressed or embarrassed. But Sarah barely heard his words. She was exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced, her body running on nothing but adrenaline and determination. For consecutive fights against experienced opponents had pushed her to the absolute edge of her capabilities, and she still had one more challenge ahead of her. The final opponent was Master Sergeant Hayes herself. "I've been saving the best for last, Martinez," Hayes said as she stepped onto the mat. The fight began with Hayes attacking immediately, not giving Sarah any time to recover from her previous battles or analyze her opponent's strengths and weaknesses. Hayes fought with the intensity of actual combat, treating Sarah not as a recruit to be tested, but as an enemy to be destroyed. Sarah found herself being systematically dismantled. Every technique she had used successfully in previous fights, Hayes had a counter for. Every tactical adjustment Sarah tried to make, Hayes had already anticipated. Worse, Sarah's exhaustion was making it impossible for her to think clearly or respond quickly enough to keep up with Hayes' relentless assault. Within the first minute of the fight, Sarah was on the ground with Hayes in a dominant position, applying a chokehold that would have ended the fight if this had been actual combat. Sarah could feel consciousness slipping away as Hayes' arm pressed against her carotid arteries, cutting off blood flow to her brain. But in that moment of near defeat, something crystallized in Sarah's mind. She realized that she had been approaching each fight as a separate challenge, trying to defeat each opponent using techniques specifically designed to counter their individual strengths. But Hayes wasn't just another opponent. She was the culmination of everything Sarah had been working toward. Instead of trying to find a specific technique to defeat Hayes, Sarah began to fight with the same total commitment that Hayes was bringing to the engagement. She stopped holding back, stopped worrying about causing injury or following the unwritten rules of training exercises, and started fighting like her life genuinely depended on the outcome. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Sarah's movements became more fluid, more instinctive, less constrained by the formal techniques she had been taught. She began to fight not like a recruit trying to prove herself, but like a Marine defending something precious. Hayes felt the change immediately. "There you are," she muttered as Sarah broke free from the chokehold and reversed their positions. "I was wondering when you were going to start really fighting." What followed was unlike any training exercise anyone present had ever witnessed. Hayes and Sarah fought with a level of intensity and commitment that blurred the line between training and actual combat. They used every technique, every advantage, every ounce of strength and, well, they possessed. The crowd of observers had grown silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just about a recruit proving herself anymore. It was about two warriors testing each other against the highest possible standards. The fight ended when both combatants simultaneously achieved submission holds on each other. Hayes had Sarah in an armbar that should have forced immediate surrender, while Sarah had applied pressure to nerve clusters that should have incapacitated Hayes instantly. They held their positions for a long moment, each waiting for the other to submit, before Hayes finally released her hold and stepped back. "Draw," Hayes announced to the stunned crowd. "Martinez, you just fought me to a draw." Sarah collapsed to her knees, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion that she had been fighting off through sheer willpower. She had done it. She had faced 5 opponents in succession, including the most feared instructor at Camp Pendleton, and she had emerged victorious or tied in every engagement. The silence that followed was broken by slow applause from the crowd of observers. It started with Corporal Williams and spread through the gathered Marines until everyone present was clapping. Sarah looked up to see faces that had previously shown skepticism or dismissal, now displaying unmistakable respect and admiration. Master Sergeant Hayes extended a hand to help Sarah to her feet. "Martinez, in 30 years of training Marines, I have never seen anything like what you just accomplished. You didn't just prove that you belong here. You proved that you belong anywhere." As Sarah stood on shaking legs, supported by Hayes's steady grip, she realized that something fundamental had changed. She was no longer the small recruit who had to prove herself against everyone's expectations. She had become something different, a Marine who had earned her place through demonstrated excellence rather than inherited advantages. The walk back to the barracks was a blur of congratulations and expressions of respect from fellow recruits and instructors alike. Marcus Thompson, who had been among the loudest voices questioning Sarah's place at Camp Pendleton, approached her with obvious humility. "Martinez," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. More than an apology, actually. What you did today, that was the most impressive thing I've ever seen. I'd be honored to serve alongside you." Sarah accepted his words with grace, understanding that Marcus's change of heart represented something larger than just one person's opinion. She had transformed not just her own perception of what was possible, but everyone else's perception as well. That night, as she lay in her bunk trying to process the events of the day, Sarah reflected on how completely her situation had changed. A few weeks ago, she had been the recruit everyone expected to wash out. Now, she was being talked about as one of the most promising Marines in the training program. But, more importantly, she had discovered something about herself that she hadn't known before. Under pressure, when everything was on the line, she didn't just survive, she excelled. The qualities that had made her seem unsuited for military life, her analytical nature, her preference for thinking before acting, her tendency to find unconventional solutions to problems, had actually made her a better Marine than anyone had imagined possible. The challenges ahead would be different, but Sarah now faced them with complete confidence in her own abilities. She had proven herself against the best opponents Camp Pendleton could offer, and she had emerged victorious. Whatever came next, she would be ready for it. 3 weeks after her legendary 5-opponent gauntlet, Sarah Martinez found herself facing a different kind of challenge entirely. The physical training that had once seemed impossible now felt manageable. Her tactical skills had earned genuine respect from instructors and fellow recruits alike, and her reputation had spread far beyond the confines of her own platoon. But success, she was learning, came with its own set of complications. Word of her performance had reached the upper echelons of Camp Pendleton's command structure, and Sarah suddenly found herself under a microscope that felt more intense than any physical training she had endured. Colonel Patricia Morrison, the base commander, had requested a personal meeting, something that happened perhaps once in 1,000 recruits' entire training experience. Sarah stood at attention in Colonel Morrison's office, surrounded by commendations, battle flags, and photographs that chronicled decades of Marine Corps history. Morrison herself was a legend within the Corps, a woman who had broken barriers and commanded respect through nearly 3 decades of exceptional service. She studied Sarah with the kind of analytical gaze that suggested she was seeing far more than just a recruit in training. "At ease, Martinez," Morrison said. her voice carrying the authority that came from years of command. "I've been reading your files, and I have to admit, they make for fascinating reading. Engineering degree from Texas A&M, top 10% of your class, multiple academic honors. You could have walked into any number of high-paying civilian careers. What brings someone with your background to my Marine Corps?" It was a question Sarah had been asked before, but never by someone whose opinion could literally shape the course of her military career. She chose her words carefully, understanding that this conversation was about much more than satisfying curiosity. "Colonel, I joined the Marines because I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself. My education taught me how to solve problems, but I wanted to solve problems that really matter. I wanted to serve my country and prove that effective service comes in many different forms." Morrison nodded slowly, making notes on a tablet that Sarah couldn't see. "Your instructors tell me that you've redefined their understanding of what effective combat looks like. Master Sergeant Hayes, in particular, has some very interesting things to say about your tactical approach. She's recommended you for advanced combat leadership training, something we typically reserve for recruits who show exceptional promise for special operations." Sarah felt her heart rate spike. Special operations training was the pinnacle of Marine Corps achievement, reserved for the absolute elite. The idea that she might be considered for such a program seemed almost surreal. However, Morrison continued, and Sarah could sense a significant qualification coming. "There are concerns. Some people in the command structure worry that your unconventional approach to combat might not translate well to real-world situations where lives are on the line. Training scenarios are one thing, but actual combat is something entirely different." The colonel stood and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds where Sarah had first struggled to keep up with her larger, stronger fellow recruits. "I'm offering you an opportunity, Martinez. In 2 weeks, we're hosting a joint training exercise with Special Forces units from multiple branches of the military. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Air Force Special Tactics, the best warriors our country has to offer. You'll be participating as part of an experimental program to evaluate new approaches to small unit tactics." Morrison turned back to face Sarah directly. "But I want to be clear about what this means. You won't be fighting against other recruits or even experienced Marines. You'll be going up against operators who have years of real combat experience, who have faced actual enemies under life and death conditions. If your techniques work in that environment, you'll have proven something significant. If they don't..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah understood perfectly. This was the ultimate test, and failure would mean not just personal disappointment, but potentially the end of her military career before it had really begun. "I understand, Colonel. I accept the opportunity." Morrison smiled for the first time during the interview. "I thought you might." "Dismissed, Martinez. And good luck." The 2 weeks that followed were unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her time at Camp Pendleton. Instead of the familiar routine of basic training, she found herself involved in advanced tactical planning sessions, specialized combat scenarios, and briefings that felt more like military intelligence operations than training exercises. She was assigned to a special unit consisting of 6 Marines, each selected for specific skills and capabilities. Sarah quickly realized that she was the only recruit in the group. The others were all experienced Marines with multiple deployments and combat experience. Leading the unit was Captain Jake Rodriguez, a decorated veteran whose reputation for tactical innovation had earned him respect throughout the Corps. "Martinez," Rodriguez said during their first team meeting, "I've heard about your performance in training, and I've specifically requested you for this unit. But I want to be clear about something. In this exercise, you're not a recruit trying to prove herself. You're a Marine with a job to do. I expect you to perform at the level of any other member of this team." The other team members introduced themselves with the casual professionalism of warriors who had served together in dangerous places. Sergeant First Class Mike Thompson, no relation to Marcus Thompson from Sarah's platoon, was a sniper whose precision with long-range weapons had saved countless lives in Afghanistan. Corporal Lisa Park was an explosives specialist whose understanding of demolitions and breaching techniques was considered among the best in the Corps. Staff Sergeant David Martinez, the coincidence of their shared surname wasn't lost on Sarah, was a communications expert who could coordinate complex operations across multiple units and command levels. The final team member was perhaps the most interesting, Gunnery Sergeant Maria Santos, the same veteran who had been Sarah's third opponent during the 5-fighter gauntlet. Santos looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal curiosity. "Martinez," Santos said after the formal introductions were complete, I've been thinking about our fight for weeks. I've never been beaten by a recruit before, and I'm still not entirely sure how you managed it. I'm looking forward to seeing how your techniques work in a more complex environment. The joint training exercise was structured as a series of escalating scenarios designed to test every aspect of small unit operations. The participating Special Forces units would rotate through different challenges, competing not just for completion time, but for tactical effectiveness, innovation, and adaptability under pressure. Sarah's team drew the opening scenario, a hostage rescue operation in an urban environment. The setup was elaborate, with professional actors playing hostages and opposing forces, multiple buildings converted into a complex tactical environment, and monitoring systems that would track every aspect of their performance. The briefing revealed a situation that was both realistic and challenging. A group of terrorists had taken control of a multi-story office building, holding civilian hostages on multiple floors while maintaining strong defensive positions at all access points. Traditional assault approaches would likely result in heavy casualties among both the rescue force and the hostages. As the team gathered around a scale model of the target building, Captain Rodriguez outlined a conventional approach. Standard protocol would be to establish perimeter security, cut off all escape routes, then conduct a coordinated breach from multiple entry points simultaneously. We overwhelmed their defensive positions through superior firepower and tactical coordination. It was a sound plan that reflected decades of military doctrine and proven effectiveness. But, as Sarah studied the building model, her engineering background began to identify potential problems with the conventional approach. The building's architecture created natural choke points that would favor the defenders, and the multi-story layout meant that even a successful breach at the ground level wouldn't guarantee access to the hostages on upper floors. "Captain," Sarah said carefully, "I may have some thoughts about alternative approaches." Rodriguez looked at her with interest. "Go ahead, Martinez. That's exactly why you're here." Sarah moved to the building model and began pointing out architectural features that could be exploited. The conventional approach assumes we need to fight through their defensive positions, but what if we could bypass them entirely? This building has external fire escapes, utility access points, and a roof that could support multiple insertion methods. Instead of going through their defenses, we could go around them. Sergeant Thompson looked skeptical. "That's assuming we can get teams into position without being detected. These aren't training dummies we're going up against. These are experienced operators who will be watching for exactly that kind of approach." "Not necessarily," Sarah replied, her mind working through the tactical possibilities. "If we stage the conventional assault as expected, their attention will be focused on defending against that attack. While they're dealing with what appears to be our main effort, smaller teams could be infiltrating through alternative access points." What followed was an intense tactical planning session that drew on every team member's expertise. Thompson's sniper skills would provide overwatch and eliminate key defensive positions. Park's explosives knowledge would create diversions and breach points that would confuse the enemy's understanding of where the real assault was coming from. Martinez's communication skills would coordinate multiple simultaneous operations across different locations within the building. But the key to the plan was Sarah's tactical innovation. Instead of treating the hostage rescue as a single operation, they would conduct 3 simultaneous but apparently unrelated operations that would converge at the critical moment. The enemy would be forced to defend against multiple threats without understanding how they were connected until it was too late to respond effectively. When they presented their plan to the exercise controllers, Sarah could see surprise and interest on faces that had probably seen every possible variation of hostage rescue tactics. The plan was complex, risky, and completely different from anything in the standard playbook. "Martinez," one of the controllers said, "this is either brilliant or completely insane. Are you confident your team can execute something this complex under pressure?" Sarah looked at Captain Rodriguez, who nodded slightly. "We're confident, sir. The plan plays to each team member's strengths and creates multiple redundancies in case any single element fails." The exercise began before dawn, with Sarah's team taking positions around the target building under cover of darkness. Sarah found herself paired with Gunnery Sergeant Santos, responsible for infiltrating through the building's utility systems and reaching the hostages on the 3rd floor. As they moved through the pre-dawn darkness, Santos spoke quietly. "Martinez, I have to ask, are you nervous about this? Because if you are, that's completely normal. This is about as close to real combat as training gets." Sarah considered the question as they approached their insertion point. "I'm focused, Sergeant. I trust our plan, I trust our team, and I trust my training. Beyond that, nervousness doesn't help anyone. Santos smiled in the darkness. Good answer. Let's go save some hostages. The infiltration phase went exactly as planned. While Captain Rodriguez led a noisy and highly visible assault on the building's main entrance, drawing the attention of the defending forces, Sarah and Santos slipped through a utility access that Sarah had identified during her architectural analysis. The building's defenders were so focused on the apparent main assault that they completely missed the smaller infiltration teams moving through alternative access points. Sarah's engineering background proved invaluable as they navigated through the building's infrastructure. She could read the architectural layout intuitively, understanding not just where passages led, but also which routes would provide the best concealment and the fastest access to their objectives. They reached the third floor to find a complex tactical situation. The hostages were being held in a large conference room, guarded by 3 terrorists who were positioned to watch all the obvious approaches. Traditional rescue doctrine would require overwhelming force to neutralize the guards before they could harm the hostages, but the confined space and proximity of civilians made that approach extremely risky. Sarah studied the situation and realized that their unconventional infiltration had given them an advantage that conventional tactics couldn't provide: complete surprise. The guards were expecting an assault to come from the direction of the main stairwells and elevators. They weren't watching for threats that might emerge from unexpected directions. Using hand signals, Sarah coordinated with Santos to approach the conference room from 2 different utility access points that placed them behind the guards' positions. The takedown was swift and silent, with both guards neutralized before they could react to the threat or endanger the hostages. Hostages secure on floor 3, Sarah reported through her radio, her voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Similar reports came in from the other team members, each confirming successful completion of their assigned objectives. The entire operation, from initial infiltration to final hostage security, had taken less than 12 minutes, a time that the exercise controllers later described as unprecedented for this type of complex scenario. During the post-exercise debriefing, Sarah found herself the focus of intense attention from Special Forces operators who had been observing the exercise. A Navy SEAL lieutenant commander approached her with obvious interest. "Martinez, I'm Commander Sarah Walsh. I watched your team's performance today, and I have to say, I've never seen a hostage rescue executed with that level of tactical innovation. Where did you learn to think outside conventional doctrine like that?" Sarah had learned to be careful about how she explained her approach, understanding that too much emphasis on her civilian education might make her seem less committed to military service. "Commander, I think it comes from approaching tactical problems the same way I would approach any other kind of problem, by analyzing all the available variables and looking for solutions that might not be immediately obvious." Walsh nodded approvingly. That kind of analytical thinking is exactly what Special Operations needs. We're dealing with increasingly complex threats that require innovative responses. Cookie-cutter solutions aren't enough anymore. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Army Ranger Captain Michael Chun, who had been leading one of the competing teams in the exercise. Chin's expression was a mixture of respect and competitive interest. "Martinez, your team's performance today was impressive, but I'm curious how your approach would work against opponents who are specifically prepared for unconventional tactics." The scenario today assumed enemies who were following predictable defensive patterns. Real adversaries adapt. It was a fair challenge, and Sarah knew that Chun was essentially asking whether her innovations were just clever tricks that would work once, or genuine tactical improvements that would remain effective against adapting enemies. "Captain, you're absolutely right that adaptive enemies require adaptive solutions. But I think that actually plays to our advantage. Conventional tactics are predictable because they've been refined over decades of use. Everyone knows how to defend against them. If we can stay ahead of the adaptation curve by continuing to innovate, we maintain the initiative." What followed was an impromptu tactical discussion that drew in Special Operations personnel from all the participating units. Sarah found herself at the center of a professional debate about the future of small unit tactics, with experienced warriors treating her insights as genuinely valuable contributions rather than the observations of a recruit trying to prove herself. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Morrison, who had been observing the entire exercise from the command center. Her expression was unreadable as she approached the group of Special Operations personnel clustered around Sarah. "I hate to break up this tactical symposium," Morrison said, "but I need to speak with Martinez privately." As they walked away from the group, Sarah tried to read Morrison's expression for some indication of whether her performance had been viewed positively or negatively. The colonel's face revealed nothing until they were out of earshot of the other personnel. "Martinez," Morrison said finally, "what you accomplished today has created quite a stir. I've received requests from 3 different special operations units asking about your availability for advanced training programs. The Navy SEALs want to evaluate you for their Combat Tactics Development Program. Army Special Forces is interested in your potential for their Unconventional Warfare Specialists. And the Marines' own Force Reconnaissance Unit has formally requested that you be assigned to their advanced training pipeline." Sarah felt her head spinning. A few months ago, she had been struggling to complete basic physical training. Now, the most elite units in the American military were competing for her services. "However," Morrison continued, "I want you to understand what accepting any of these opportunities would mean. Special operations training has a failure rate of over 80%. It's designed to push personnel beyond their absolute limits, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Many people who attempt it never recover from the experience, even if they don't complete the program." Morrison stopped walking and turned to face Sarah directly. "You've already proven more than anyone expected you to prove. You could complete basic training, accept a standard assignment, and have a successful military career without ever taking another major risk. Are you certain you want to continue pushing the boundaries of what's possible?" Sarah thought about the question as she looked out over the training grounds where she had first struggled to prove herself. She thought about the recruits who had doubted her, the instructors who had questioned whether she belonged, and the long journey that had brought her to this moment of decision. "Colonel," Sarah said finally, "I didn't join the Marine Corps to play it safe. I joined to find out what I was truly capable of achieving. If special operations training can help me reach that potential, then that's what I want to do." Morrison smiled, and for the first time, Sarah saw genuine warmth in the expression. "I hoped you would say that, Martinez. But I want you to take tonight to think about it seriously. Tomorrow morning, you'll give me your final decision. And whichever direction you choose, you'll be doing it with the complete support of everyone who has had the privilege of watching you prove that greatness comes in many different forms." That evening, as Sarah lay in her bunk thinking about the choice that lay ahead, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since arriving at Camp Pendleton. The girl who had been dismissed as too small and too weak had become a Marine whose innovations were being studied by the most elite warriors in the world. But, more than that, she had discovered something about herself that would shape every decision she made going forward. When faced with seemingly impossible challenges, she didn't just survive. She found ways to redefine what was possible. Tomorrow's decision would determine whether that journey continued into even more challenging territory. But, tonight, she was content to know that whatever choice she made, it would be the choice of a Marine who had earned the right to make it. Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of what would either be the greatest opportunity or the most devastating failure of her military career. 6 months after choosing to pursue special operations training, she found herself at the infamous Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance Training Facility in Quantico, Virginia, surrounded by 32 other candidates who represented the absolute elite of Marine Corps personnel. The statistics were sobering. Of the 33 Marines who had begun the program, only 8 remained. The others had either voluntarily withdrawn or been eliminated through the relentless process designed to identify the few individuals capable of operating at the highest levels of military effectiveness. Sarah was not just surviving the program. She was excelling in ways that defied every prediction and assumption about what special operations personnel should look like. The morning of the final evaluation found Sarah preparing for what the instructors called the Crucible, a 48-hour continuous exercise that would test every skill, every technique, and every ounce of determination the candidates had developed over 6 months of intensive training. Unlike the controlled exercises she had excelled at during basic training, the Crucible was designed to be as close to actual combat conditions as training could simulate. Chief Warrant Officer Michael Torres, the senior instructor whose reputation for producing elite operators was matched only by his reputation for breaking candidates who couldn't meet his standards, addressed the 8 remaining candidates in the pre-dawn darkness. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have survived training that eliminates 90% of candidates. You should feel proud of that accomplishment. However, pride won't help you in the next 48 hours. You will be operating in teams of 2, in hostile territory, against opponents who have been specifically briefed on your capabilities and trained to counter your techniques." Torres paused, letting his words sink in. These are not training dummies or role players. Your opponents are active-duty special forces operators from multiple branches of the military, supplemented by civilian contractors who specialize in tactical training. They know who you are, they know what you can do, and they are being paid significant bonuses for every candidate they eliminate. Sarah felt a familiar calm settling over her as Torres outlined the parameters of the exercise. She had learned to recognize this feeling, the moment when her analytical mind shifted into the focused state that allowed her to process complex tactical information and develop innovative solutions under extreme pressure. She was partnered with Staff Sergeant James Rodriguez, a veteran Force Recon Marine who had specifically requested to work with Sarah based on his observation of her performance during training. Rodriguez was everything Sarah wasn't: tall, powerfully built, and experienced in conventional special operations techniques. But over the months of training, he had become one of her most vocal advocates. "Martinez," Rodriguez said as they conducted their final equipment check, "I want you to know that working with you has completely changed how I think about tactics. Before this program, I thought innovation was about perfecting existing techniques. You've taught me that real innovation sometimes means throwing out the playbook entirely." Their mission was both simple in concept and extraordinarily complex in execution. Infiltrate a heavily defended compound, extract a high-value target, and escape to a predetermined extraction point, all while being hunted by a larger force that knew their general location and mission objectives. What made the scenario particularly challenging was the compound's location in dense forest terrain that favored the defenders. The facility was surrounded by multiple layers of security, including electronic surveillance systems, roving patrols, and fixed defensive positions manned by experienced operators who understood exactly what they were defending against. As Sarah and Rodriguez approached their target area under cover of darkness, Sarah's mind was already working through the tactical complexities of the situation. Traditional special operations doctrine would emphasize stealth infiltration, precise timing, and overwhelming force applied at the critical moment. It was a proven approach that had succeeded in countless real-world operations. But Sarah had learned to look beyond proven approaches toward solutions that opponents wouldn't anticipate. As they conducted their reconnaissance of the target compound, she began to see possibilities that conventional training might miss. "Rodriguez," she said quietly as they observed the patrol patterns from a concealed position, "I think we're approaching this wrong." Rodriguez looked at her with interest. Over the months of training, he had learned to pay attention when Sarah suggested alternative approaches. "What are you thinking?" Sarah pointed toward the compound's defensive layout. "Everyone expects us to try to sneak in, grab the target, and sneak out. The entire defensive scheme is designed around preventing that exact approach. But what if we didn't try to avoid their defenses? What if we used them against each other?" What Sarah was proposing was so fundamentally different from special operations doctrine that it took Rodriguez a moment to process the implications. Instead of trying to infiltrate undetected, Sarah was suggesting that they deliberately trigger the compound's security systems in a coordinated way that would create confusion and misdirection among the defenders. "Martinez, that's either the most brilliant tactical innovation I've ever heard, or it's complete suicide. How do we avoid getting killed while we're stirring up the entire defense force?" Sarah smiled in the darkness, her mind already working through the mathematical precision required to make her plan succeed. "We use their training against them. These are professional operators who have been taught to respond to security breaches in specific ways. If we can predict how they'll respond, we can create the conditions we need to complete our mission." What followed was an hour of intensive planning that drew on every aspect of their training and experience. Sarah's approach required precise timing, perfect coordination, and a deep understanding of how professional security forces would react to different types of threats. It was ambitious to the point of recklessness, but Rodriguez found himself convinced that it might actually work. The execution began with Sarah and Rodriguez deliberately triggering motion sensors on the compound's eastern perimeter. As expected, the security response was immediate and overwhelming. Multiple teams converged on the area where the sensors had been activated, following protocols designed to contain and neutralize infiltrators. But while the security teams were focused on what appeared to be a clumsy infiltration attempt on the eastern side, Sarah and Rodriguez were already moving toward their actual objective on the opposite side of the compound. The triggered sensors had created exactly the kind of distraction they needed to approach the main facility undetected. The high-value target was being held in the compound's central building, guarded by a team that should have been impossible for two operators to overcome. Under normal circumstances, any attempt to extract the target would have required either overwhelming firepower or elaborate deception. Sarah's approach required neither. Instead of trying to fight through or sneak past the guards, Sarah and Rodriguez created a scenario where the guards voluntarily abandoned their positions. By manipulating the compound's communication systems and creating false reports of multiple security breaches, they convinced the guard force that the target was about to be moved to a more secure location. The guards followed their protocols perfectly, preparing to escort the target to what they believed was a safer facility. But Sarah and Rodriguez had positioned themselves along the route, turning the guards' own security procedures into a delivery system that brought the target directly to them. The extraction itself was a masterpiece of tactical misdirection. Sarah and Rodriguez intercepted the target during the transfer, but instead of immediately attempting to escape, they continued the charade of being part of the security response. Using captured communication equipment and their understanding of military protocols, they convinced the command center that they were security personnel who had successfully secured the target and were moving him to the extraction point. The compound's security force actually provided escort services for the first half of their escape route, believing they were supporting their own operation. By the time anyone realized what had actually happened, Sarah and Rodriguez were already approaching the extraction point with their mission successfully completed. Chief Torres was waiting at the extraction point, along with the exercise observers who had been monitoring every aspect of the operation. His expression as Sarah and Rodriguez arrived with their target was a mixture of disbelief and professional admiration. Martinez, Rodriguez, Torres said as they delivered the extracted target. I have been conducting training exercises for 15 years, and I have never seen anything remotely like what you just accomplished. You didn't just complete the mission, you redefined what the mission could be. The debrief that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her military career. Instead of the usual critique of performance and identification of areas for improvement, the session became an analysis of tactical innovation that drew interest from senior officers throughout the special operations community. Major General Patricia Hayes, no relation to the Master Sergeant Hayes from Sarah's basic training, had flown in specifically to observe the final exercises and evaluate the program's effectiveness. As the commanding general of Marine Corps Special Operations Command, her opinion would literally determine the future direction of elite training programs. Martinez, General Hayes said during the debrief, your approach to this exercise challenges fundamental assumptions about how special operations should be conducted. Some people might argue that what you did was reckless, that you succeeded through luck rather than skill. Sarah had learned to recognize when senior officers were testing her understanding rather than criticizing her performance. General, I would respectfully suggest that what might appear to be luck was actually the result of careful analysis and preparation. We studied the defenders' training, their protocols, and their likely responses to different scenarios. Our approach was designed to exploit their strengths rather than trying to overcome them through superior force. General Hayes nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of thinking that modern special operations requires. Our enemies are increasingly sophisticated, increasingly adaptable. The old playbook isn't enough anymore. We need operators who can think beyond conventional limitations. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Morrison, who had traveled from Camp Pendleton specifically to observe Sarah's performance in the final exercise. Her presence represented more than just professional interest. Morrison had become personally invested in Sarah's success as validation of her own belief that excellence in military service could come from unexpected sources. General Hayes, Morrison said as she joined the discussion, I hope you've been as impressed with Martinez's performance as I have been with her development over the past year. When she first arrived at Camp Pendleton, there were serious questions about whether she had the physical capability for military service. Now she's demonstrating innovations that could influence special operations doctrine for years to come. What followed was a professional discussion that treated Sarah not as a student being evaluated, but as a colleague whose insights were genuinely valuable. The conversation covered tactical innovation, the future of special operations training, and the evolving nature of modern warfare that required increasingly adaptive responses. The formal results of the Crucible were announced the following morning. Of the 8 candidates who had entered the final exercise, 6 had successfully completed their missions. Sarah and Rodriguez had not just completed their mission, they had achieved what the evaluators described as unprecedented tactical innovation under extreme pressure conditions. But The real validation came in the form of assignment opportunities that represented the pinnacle of special operations career paths. Sarah found herself being recruited by units whose very existence was classified, organizations that conducted operations in support of national security objectives that would never be publicly acknowledged. The choice she faced was both exciting and daunting. Each opportunity represented a different path toward applying her skills in service of her country, but also a different level of risk and commitment that would shape the rest of her life. Admiral Sarah Chun, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, made her case during a private meeting that emphasized the joint nature of modern special operations. Martinez, the future of special operations is integrated teams that can operate across all domains: land, sea, air, and cyber. Your analytical approach to tactical problems makes you exactly the kind of operator we need for next-generation missions. Army Colonel Michael Torres, no relation to Chief Torres from the training program, offered a different perspective during his recruitment pitch. What you've demonstrated is the ability to think beyond the constraints that limit most operators. We have missions that require exactly that kind of innovative thinking, operations where following the playbook isn't just insufficient, it's potentially catastrophic. The Marine Corps, through General Hayes, presented their own case. Martinez, you've already proven that marine innovation can lead to tactical breakthroughs. We want you to help us develop the next generation of special operations capabilities, training the Marines who will face threats we can't even imagine yet. Each offer represented an extraordinary opportunity, but they also represented a level of commitment and risk that Sarah had never contemplated when she first decided to join the Marines. These were not conventional military assignments with predictable duties and standard career progression. These were positions that would place her at the cutting edge of military operations where success and failure were measured not in training scores, but in lives saved or lost. As Sarah considered her options, she realized that her journey from dismissed recruit to sought-after special operator had taught her something fundamental about herself. She thrived not despite challenges and uncertainty, but because of them. Every time she had been placed in a situation where conventional wisdom suggested she would fail, she had found ways to succeed by redefining the parameters of success itself. The decision she faced was not just about which assignment to accept, but about what kind of operator and what kind of person she wanted to become. Each opportunity would develop different aspects of her capabilities and contribute differently to her country's defense, but they would also expose her to different types of risks and require different types of sacrifices. That evening, as she walked through the Quantico training facility where she had spent the most challenging and rewarding months of her life, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point of decision. She thought about the drill instructors who had questioned whether she belonged in the Marine Corps, the fellow recruits who had dismissed her as too weak for military service, and the long progression of challenges that had each seemed impossible until she proved otherwise. Tomorrow, she would make her decision about which path to follow next. But tonight, she was content to know that whatever choice she made, it would be the choice of someone who had earned the right to make it through demonstrated excellence rather than inherited advantages. The girl they had called weak during training had become a Marine whose innovations were being studied and implemented by the most elite warriors in the world. The transformation was complete, but the journey was just beginning. 2 years after completing force reconnaissance training, Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez found herself in a position she could never have imagined during those early days at Camp Pendleton when her fellow recruits had questioned whether she belonged in the Marine Corps. She was standing in the Pentagon briefing room, presenting tactical innovations to a Joint Chiefs Committee that included the highest-ranking military officers in the United States. The journey from basic training to this moment had been marked by a series of classified operations that had validated every prediction about her potential. Sarah's unconventional approach to tactical problems had proven effective not just in training scenarios, but in real-world situations where lives were genuinely at stake, and failure meant consequences that extended far beyond military careers. General Patricia Hayes, now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, introduced Sarah to the assembled senior officers with words that still seemed surreal even as they were being spoken. Gentlemen and ladies, Staff Sergeant Martinez has been instrumental in developing tactical approaches that have fundamentally changed how we think about small unit operations. Her innovations have been successfully implemented in classified operations across multiple theaters, and her analytical approach to tactical problems has become a model for training programs throughout the special operations community. Sarah Luke.